How much can a single mistake cost? $100 million? The loss of an entire ship? Or even hundreds of human lives? Some of history's most devastating disasters were not caused by nature. Sometimes engineers saw the danger coming. Sometimes a building itself showed warning signs before collapsing. And sometimes there was still time to stop everything, but no one did. In one case, a tiny calculation error caused the loss of a multi-million-dollar spacecraft. In another, a single decision changed the fate of an entire sea. And in yet another, just a few seconds of misunderstanding cost 583 lives. Today, we're looking at 10 human mistakes that led to some of the most devastating consequences in history. If you enjoy exploring shocking and unbelievable stories from history, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like. Let's begin. Number 10. The Tenerife Airport Disaster. The deadliest accident in aviation history happened not in the sky, but on the ground. On March 27, 1977, Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. That day, 2 Boeing 747s were never supposed to be in Tenerife. Their original destination was Gran Canaria Airport on a neighboring island. But after a bomb exploded at Gran Canaria Airport, air traffic was temporarily suspended. As a result, numerous incoming flights were diverted to Tenerife. Within a short time, the small Los Rodeos Airport became overcrowded with large passenger aircraft. Among them were KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736, both Boeing 747s. When Gran Canaria Airport finally reopened, the aircraft began preparing to continue their journeys. But then the situation suddenly became far more dangerous. A thick fog rolled over the airport. Visibility dropped so dramatically that the flight crews could barely see other aircraft on the runway. The Pan Am Boeing 747 was taxiing along the main runway, searching for the exit it had been instructed to take. At the same time, the KLM Boeing 747 was positioned at the opposite end of that same runway, preparing for departure. The pilots of both aircraft and the air traffic controllers were communicating by radio. But this is where several small problems began to come together. Some radio transmissions overlapped, parts of the messages were not heard clearly, and crucial instructions were misunderstood. Because of the dense fog, neither crew could see what was happening at the other end of the runway. Then the KLM captain began accelerating for takeoff. The massive Boeing 747 raced down the runway, but the Pan Am aircraft had not yet cleared it. Even the KLM flight engineer reportedly questioned whether the Pan Am aircraft was still on the runway. But the crew believed the runway was clear. In reality, the 2 enormous aircraft were moving directly toward each other through the fog. Suddenly, the Pan Am crew saw lights emerging from the fog. Within seconds, they realized what was happening. A Boeing 747 was speeding directly toward them. The Pan Am pilots desperately tried to turn their aircraft off the runway. The KLM captain also saw the aircraft ahead and attempted to lift his Boeing 747 into the air as quickly as possible. But it was too late. The 2 Boeing 747s collided. All 248 people aboard the KLM aircraft were killed. Of the 396 people aboard the Pan Am aircraft, 61 survived. In total, 583 people lost their lives that day, making the Tenerife Airport disaster the deadliest accident in aviation history. What makes this tragedy even more shocking is that neither aircraft suffered an engine failure. Neither plane had lost control in the sky. This disaster was not caused by a single technical malfunction. Instead, several circumstances came together. The bombing at another airport, the diversion of aircraft to Tenerife, an overcrowded airport, dense fog, miscommunication over the radio, and finally, the beginning of a takeoff without confirmed clearance. One factor after another combined to create one of the worst disasters in aviation history. The Tenerife disaster became a major lesson for the entire aviation industry. Because sometimes, a catastrophe does not require one massive technical failure. A series of small mistakes, critical decisions, and just a few seconds of misunderstanding can change the fate of 583 people forever. Number 9. The Bhopal Gas Disaster. On the night of December 2nd to 3rd, 1984, most residents of Bhopal, India, were asleep in their homes. But at that very moment, an invisible toxic cloud was moving toward them. Most people had no idea what was about to happen. In Bhopal stood a large pesticide plant operated by Union Carbide. The facility stored a highly toxic chemical known as methyl isocyanate, or MIC. Under normal conditions, this chemical had to be stored in specially designed tanks under strict safety controls. But that night, water entered one of the storage tanks. When the water reacted with the chemical, the temperature inside the tank rose rapidly. The pressure began to increase, and the situation became more dangerous with every passing minute. Even worse, several safety systems designed to prevent such a disaster were not functioning effectively. Eventually, the pressure inside the tank became so great that toxic gas began escaping into the atmosphere. Tens of tons of poisonous gas spread into the air. The wind carried the toxic cloud toward densely populated neighborhoods surrounding the plant. Thousands of people were still asleep. Before long, residents began waking up. Their eyes were burning. They struggled to breathe. Confused and terrified, people rushed out of their homes and into the streets. But the air outside was no safer. Panic spread through the city as people desperately tried to escape the toxic cloud. Thousands of people died in the immediate aftermath, and many more were exposed to the poisonous gas. But the tragedy did not end that night. In the years that followed, many survivors suffered from respiratory illnesses, eye problems, and other serious health complications. Estimates of the death toll vary. Official figures recorded several thousand deaths in the immediate aftermath, while estimates that include later deaths linked to the disaster reach well into the tens of thousands. More than 500,000 people were exposed to the gas. But there is one fact that makes this disaster even more disturbing. This was not a natural disaster. It was the result of multiple failures in industrial safety and a chain of disastrous decisions. Problems with chemical storage and safety systems, inadequate emergency preparedness, and the plant's location near densely populated neighborhoods all contributed to the scale of the catastrophe. The Bhopal disaster left the world with a devastating lesson. In dangerous industries, the true cost of cutting corners on safety can eventually become immeasurable. Number 8. Mars Climate Orbiter. A $125 million measurement mistake. Sometimes you don't need an exploding engine or a computer failure to lose a spacecraft. All it takes is a mistake involving two different systems of measurement. In December 1998, NASA launched a spacecraft called the Mars Climate Orbiter toward Mars. Its mission was to study the Martian atmosphere, weather, and climate. The spacecraft itself cost approximately $125 million. It traveled through space for more than 9 months, covering millions of miles. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. On September 23, 1999, the spacecraft finally reached Mars. It was supposed to fire its engine and enter orbit around the planet. NASA engineers on Earth carefully monitored its progress. A few minutes later, the Mars Climate Orbiter passed behind Mars. Radio communication with the spacecraft was expected to disappear temporarily. That was completely normal. The engineers waited. Once the spacecraft emerged from the other side of Mars, Its signal was supposed to return. 1 minute passed. No signal. Then several more minutes passed. Still nothing. NASA engineers repeatedly tried to contact the spacecraft, but the Mars Climate Orbiter never responded. A spacecraft worth approximately $125 million had disappeared just as it reached Mars. So what happened? When investigators began looking into the failure, they discovered an incredibly simple and astonishing mistake. Different engineering teams had been working on the mission. One system provided calculations using English units, while the spacecraft's navigation software expected the data in metric units. At first, the discrepancy didn't appear to be a major problem. But as the spacecraft traveled toward Mars for months, the difference between its calculated trajectory and its actual trajectory became increasingly significant. As a result, the spacecraft approached Mars at a much lower altitude than planned. NASA's later calculations suggested that it may have descended to an altitude of approximately 57 kilometers. The minimum altitude considered safe for the mission was around 80 kilometers. After that, communication with the Mars Climate Orbiter was lost forever. Exactly what happened to the spacecraft was never directly observed. It may have been destroyed in the Martian atmosphere, or it may have passed Mars on a different trajectory. But the mission was over, and perhaps the most astonishing part was that the failure wasn't caused by some impossibly complicated problem in space physics. It wasn't because the engineers didn't understand meters and feet. The problem was that different teams and software systems were operating under the assumption that they were using the same units. There had even been warning signs in the navigation data, but the full problem was not identified before the spacecraft reached Mars. Millions of miles of travel, 9 months in space, the work of hundreds of specialists, and a spacecraft worth around $125 million, all lost because of a mismatch that, at first glance, seemed incredibly small. The Mars Climate Orbiter became one of the most famous cautionary tales in the history of space exploration. In space, there is no such thing as a small mistake. Sometimes, the difference between two measurement systems can keep you from reaching an entire planet.
Number 7. The Sampoong department store collapse. On June 29, 1995, in Seoul, South Korea, one of the city's most famous shopping centers was filled with thousands of people. Some were shopping, others were eating in restaurants. Employees were going about their usual work. From the outside, everything appeared completely normal. But earlier that day, the building itself had already begun showing signs of danger. Employees at restaurants on the upper floor noticed large cracks in the floor. In some places, the cracks were becoming wider. These weren't simply cosmetic cracks. They were signs that the building had serious structural problems. And the most disturbing part was that those problems had begun years earlier, while the building was still being constructed. Sampoong was originally designed as a 4-story office building, but later its owner, Lee Jun, decided to turn it into a large department store. The original plans were changed. Then a 5th floor was added to the building, where restaurants were located. Korean restaurants commonly used underfloor heating systems. Because of this, the floor of the 5th story became significantly heavier than originally planned. But the changes didn't stop there. Several heavy air conditioning units were installed on the roof. Later, when they needed to be moved to another location, instead of lifting them with a crane, they were dragged across the roof. This caused additional damage to the roof structure. Over the years, the weight placed on the building continued to increase, and some of the supporting columns had been made narrower than specified in the original design. Then came June 29, 1995. At approximately 5:57 p.m., a large section of the building suddenly collapsed. The 5 floors fell down one on top of another. Within seconds, a massive department store filled with shoppers had turned into a pile of concrete and debris.
Hundreds of people were trapped beneath the collapsed structure. Rescue operations continued for days. In the end, 502 people were killed and more than 900 were injured. But amid the devastation, there were extraordinary stories of survival. 19-year-old Park Sung-hyun was rescued alive after spending 17 days trapped beneath the rubble. The investigation that followed showed that the Sampoong disaster wasn't caused by a single mistake. Changes to the building's original design, construction deficiencies, excessive weight, dangerous modifications to the structure, and finally, the failure to fully evacuate the building in time, even after warning signs had appeared. The Sampoong department store disaster demonstrated something terrifying. A crack in a building is sometimes more than just a crack. It can be a warning, and ignoring that warning can cost hundreds of lives.
Number 6. The Trojan Horse. One decision brought down an entire city. For 10 long years, the enemy had tried to conquer Troy and failed. But imagine this. One morning you wake up and discover that the enemy army has suddenly disappeared. And right outside your city gates, they have left behind a massive wooden horse. Would you bring it inside your city, believing it was a symbol of victory? According to legend, that is exactly what the people of Troy did. And that single decision changed the fate of their city forever. The story takes us back roughly 3,000 years to the legendary Trojan War. For years, the Greek armies laid siege to the city of Troy. But Troy was protected by enormous, powerful defensive walls. The Greeks simply couldn't break through them. Years passed. The war dragged on with no end in sight. Finally, the Greeks decided to try something completely different. If you can't enter by force, enter through deception. According to legend, the Greeks constructed an enormous wooden horse. But the horse wasn't really a gift. It was hollow, and hidden inside it were Greek warriors. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army boarded their ships and sailed away, making it appear as though they had finally abandoned Troy. The next morning, the Trojans stepped outside their city walls. What they saw was astonishing. The Greek army was gone. The shoreline was empty, and standing outside the gates of Troy was an enormous wooden horse. After 10 years of war, it looked as if the nightmare was finally over. But not everyone trusted the mysterious gift. In later Roman versions of the legend, the priest Laocoon warned the Trojans not to trust it. His warning would later be remembered in the famous idea, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." Another figure, Cassandra, also warned that danger was coming, but no one listened. The Trojans accepted the wooden horse as a symbol of victory. They brought it inside the city. In some versions of the legend, part of the city's defenses even had to be opened or altered to get the enormous horse inside. That night, celebrations began. The people of Troy believed the 10-year war was finally over. They celebrated their victory. Gradually, the city grew quiet. Night fell, and when everyone was asleep, the Greek warriors began climbing out of the wooden horse. They moved through the sleeping city and opened the gates. Outside Troy, the Greek army had not truly gone home. Their ships returned. With the gates now open, Greek forces entered the city. A city they had failed to conquer by force for 10 years fell through deception in a single night. Troy was destroyed. Whether every detail of the Trojan horse story happened exactly as later legends describe remains debated. But the Trojan horse became one of the most famous warnings in human history. Because sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the enemy standing outside your walls. Sometimes, it's the thing you willingly bring inside, believing it is safe. Number 5. The Aral Sea. A sea that humans almost made disappear. Once, between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there was an enormous body of water, the Aral Sea. Ports operated along its shores. Thousands of people supported their families by fishing. Ships crossed its waters every day. But just a few decades later, some of those same ships were no longer floating on water. They were sitting abandoned
in the middle of a desert. This is the story of the Aral Sea. In the early 1960s, the Aral was one of the largest inland bodies of water in the world. It was mainly fed by two great rivers, the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya. For thousands of years, these rivers carried water into the Aral Sea. But then, the Soviet Union launched an enormous agricultural project. Agricultural production in Central Asia, especially cotton production, was to be dramatically increased. And growing cotton required enormous amounts of water. So large portions of the water from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya were diverted toward agricultural fields. Hundreds of kilometers of irrigation canals were constructed. Water that once flowed toward the Aral Sea was now being redirected elsewhere. At first, the consequences didn't look terrifying. But as the years passed, the water level began to fall. The shoreline slowly retreated. Settlements that once stood directly beside the sea suddenly found themselves kilometers away from the water. Places where fishermen once launched their boats could now be crossed by car. As the Aral Sea shrank, its salinity increased. Many species of fish disappeared. The fishing industry collapsed. People living around what had once been a major fishing center lost their livelihoods. Ports were abandoned, and ships that had once sailed across the sea were left rusting on the former seabed. But the disappearance of the water was only the beginning. The exposed seabed turned into vast areas covered with salt and dust. Strong winds began carrying this salty dust across huge distances. And in some areas, residues from agricultural chemicals that had accumulated in the basin were also mixed into the airborne dust. A sea that had once supported human life had become a source of new environmental danger. But the story of the Aral Sea also has a hopeful side. Kazakhstan took action to preserve the North Aral Sea, also known as the Small Aral. The Kuk Aral Dam was constructed. After the dam was completed in 2005, water levels in the North Aral rose and salinity declined. And with those changes, parts of the ecosystem and fishing activity began to recover.
Number 4. The Vasa ship. A giant warship built to become a symbol of national pride sank on its very first voyage. At the beginning of the 17th century, Sweden was strengthening its influence in the Baltic Sea. King Gustav II Adolf needed a powerful naval fleet. In 1625, an order was given to build a massive new warship. Its name was Vasa. It was meant to display Sweden's military power to all of Europe and become a mighty fortress at sea. The ship carried 64 cannons, many of them heavy 24-pounders. Its stern was decorated with hundreds of elaborate sculptures. It was enormous. It was expensive. It was magnificent. But there was one serious problem. The ship was too tall and too heavy at the top. Two enclosed gun decks, heavy cannons, and the ship's towering structure placed enormous weight high above the waterline. But there was not enough ballast below to properly stabilize it. And here is the most shocking part. The danger was noticed before Vasa ever sailed. To test the ship's stability, around 30 men were ordered to run from one side of the deck to the other. After they crossed the deck several times, the ship began rocking so violently that the test had to be stopped. It was a warning, a clear sign that something was dangerously wrong. But despite that warning, Vasa was still allowed to begin its maiden voyage. On August 10, 1628, crowds gathered in Stockholm to watch the magnificent ship set sail for the first time. Vasa slowly moved away from the harbor. The gun ports were open. The sails were raised. People along the shore watched Sweden's new symbol of power glide across the water. At first, everything seemed normal, but Vasa had not gone far when a gust of wind hit its sails. The ship leaned to one side, then slowly righted itself. A short time later, another stronger gust struck. Vasa tilted again. But this time, the situation became far more dangerous. The lower gun ports moved dangerously close to the surface,
And then, water began pouring through the open gun ports. The crew had almost no time to react. The ship rapidly filled with water. Within minutes, one of Sweden's most powerful warships sank to the bottom of Stockholm harbor. It had barely made it away from shore. The exact number of people aboard remains uncertain, but historians generally estimate that around 30 people died. A ship that was supposed to become Sweden's pride could not even complete its first voyage. But Vasa's story did not end there. The ship remained beneath the waters of Stockholm harbor for 333 years. Then, in 1961, Vasa was raised from the seabed. Thanks to the unusual conditions of the Baltic Sea, much of its wooden hull had been remarkably well preserved. Today, the ship can be seen at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, and later investigations showed that this disaster could not simply be blamed on one person making one mistake. The ship's proportions, its top-heavy design, insufficient stability, and the decision to send it to sea despite obvious warning signs all contributed to the disaster. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of Vasa. No matter how expensive, powerful, or beautiful something is, a design that ignores the laws of engineering cannot be saved by prestige or money.
Number 3. The Halifax Explosion. A collision between two ships devastated an entire city. On the morning of December 6, 1917, in Halifax, Canada, everything seemed normal. People were heading to work. Children were getting ready for school. Ships were moving through the harbor as usual. No one knew that within just a few minutes, one of the most devastating disasters in the city's history was about to occur. And at the center of the disaster were two ships. World War I was still raging. The French cargo ship Mont Blanc was entering Halifax harbor. But this was no ordinary cargo ship. It was carrying an enormous amount of dangerous wartime explosives, including TNT, picric acid, benzol, and other explosive materials. Altogether, the explosive cargo weighed thousands of tons. At the same time, the Norwegian ship Imo was leaving the harbor in the opposite direction. The two ships began approaching each other. The passage into the harbor was narrow, and confusion arose over which side the ships should pass each other on. Signals were exchanged. Both crews tried to maneuver, but the distance between the ships had already become dangerously small. At around 8:45 a.m., Imo collided with the side of Mont Blanc. At first, it did not look like a catastrophe. Neither ship immediately sank. But Mont Blanc was carrying thousands of tons of explosive material. During the collision, barrels of benzol stored on the deck were damaged, and a fire broke out. The crew knew exactly what their ship was carrying. They understood what could happen if the flames reached the explosives. The crew of Mont Blanc abandoned the ship, got into lifeboats, and tried to move away from the shore. But the burning ship began drifting toward the Halifax waterfront. Thick black smoke rose into the sky. And what do you think people did? Instead of running away, many residents went to their windows to watch. Some stepped outside. Children looked through windows at the burning ship. Most of them had no idea what was inside Mont Blanc. They thought they were simply watching a fire in the harbor. About 20 minutes after the collision, at approximately 9:04 a.m., Mont Blanc exploded. The explosion was enormous. Fragments of the ship were hurled in every direction. A powerful shockwave swept across a large part of Halifax. Buildings collapsed. Windows shattered over a vast area. The explosion was so powerful that it is regarded as one of the largest human-made non-nuclear explosions in history. Around 2,000 people were killed. Nearly 9,000 were injured. Hundreds suffered serious eye injuries, in part because so many people had been watching the fire through their windows. But the disaster did not end with the explosion. Fires spread through the city. Thousands of people were left without homes, and the following day, a severe snowstorm struck the region, making rescue operations even more difficult. The Halifax disaster left history with a painful lesson. When dangerous cargo is being transported, catastrophe may not come from one single mistake.
Sometimes, a chain of several bad decisions can change the lives of thousands of people.
Number 2. The Seongsu Bridge collapse. A tragedy that happened in just a few seconds. On the morning of October 21st, 1994, Seoul, South Korea was waking up. People were heading to work. Children were rushing to school. Thousands of vehicles were crossing the Seongsu Bridge over the Han River. People use this bridge every single day. No one imagined that simply crossing it could be dangerous. But for some people, that morning would be the last time they ever left home. The Seongsu Bridge had opened in 1979. It was one of the important transportation links connecting different parts of Seoul. Thousands of vehicles crossed it every day. From the outside, the bridge appeared completely normal. But hidden inside its structure were problems that had been developing for years. Later investigations revealed serious construction quality defects. Some of the welding work on the bridge's steel structure had not been carried out properly. Some connections did not provide the necessary strength, and there was another problem. Seoul was growing rapidly. Traffic increased, and compared with the bridge's early years, heavy vehicles began crossing it more frequently. Over the years, repeated stress affected the bridge's weak points. The metal began to develop cracks. But the dangerous weakness was not obvious from the outside. Then came the morning of October 21st, 1994. At around 7:40 a.m., the bridge was crowded with morning traffic. Buses and cars were carrying people to work and school. Among them was City Bus number 16, carrying school students. Suddenly, one section of the bridge began to sag downward. The drivers had almost no time to react. Then approximately 48 meters of the bridge collapsed. Vehicles on top fell with it. Several cars plunged into the Han River, while the bus and part of the collapsed structure fell onto the area below. It all happened within just a few seconds. The disaster killed 32 people and injured 17 others. School students were among those who lost their lives. Investigators examined the collapsed section of the bridge. They found poor quality welding and structural defects dating back to its construction. The collapse itself lasted only seconds, but the mistakes that led to those few seconds had been made years earlier. Number 1. The Challenger Disaster. A launch carried out, despite the warnings. On January 28, 1986, in Florida, thousands of people gathered at the Kennedy Space Center, waiting for a historic moment. Millions more were watching on television, because this space mission was different. Among the 7 crew members was not only a team of astronauts, but also an ordinary schoolteacher, Krista McAuliffe. She planned to teach lessons to students from space. Across America, children gathered in front of televisions. They were about to watch a teacher fly into space. From the outside, everything looked like a celebration. But just hours before the launch, some engineers were deeply concerned. That morning in Florida was unusually cold. During the night, temperatures had dropped below freezing. Ice had even formed around the launch pad. Engineers from Morton Fiacol were particularly worried about one thing. The solid rocket boosters that would lift Challenger into the sky contained rubber seals called O-rings. Their job was simple, but absolutely critical. They were designed to prevent extremely hot gases from escaping through the booster joints. Engineers had already discovered something troubling during previous launches. The O-rings might not work properly in extremely cold temperatures. So, on the night before Challenger's launch, engineers and NASA officials held a special telephone conference. Morton Fiacol engineers recommended that Challenger should not be launched in such cold conditions. Engineer Roger Boisjoli had even warned months earlier that problems with these seals could lead to catastrophe. But after a long discussion, the company's management reversed its initial recommendation. The launch was approved. The next morning, the 7 crew members boarded Challenger. At 11:38 a.m., the engines ignited, and Challenger began rising into the sky. At first, everything appeared normal. The shuttle accelerated. It climbed higher and higher. Mission Control watched from the ground. But there was something they did not fully realize at that moment. Almost immediately after liftoff, black smoke appeared near a joint on the right solid rocket booster. In the extreme cold, the O-ring seals had failed to seal properly. For a short time, material inside the joint temporarily sealed the opening. But as Challenger climbed higher, the aerodynamic forces became stronger. About 1 minute into the flight, the situation began to deteriorate. Hot gas escaped through the joint again. A flame began striking the external fuel tank. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger was roughly 14 kilometers above Earth. And then, a massive cloud suddenly appeared in the sky. People watching on television didn't understand what they were seeing. Challenger broke apart. Pieces of the spacecraft scattered across the sky. Commentators fell silent. Spectators who had been applauding only seconds earlier stood frozen. They could barely understand what they had just witnessed. All 7 crew members were lost. Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and teacher Krista McAuliffe. But perhaps the most painful truth about the Challenger tragedy became clear afterward. A presidential commission determined that the direct technical cause of the disaster was the failure of the O-ring seals in the right solid rocket booster. But investigators did not blame only a piece of rubber. The investigation also revealed serious problems in NASA's decision-making process. The O-ring problem had been known before the disaster. Engineers had warned about the danger, and the temperature that morning was significantly lower than during previous shuttle launches. And perhaps the saddest part of all, this disaster could have been prevented. Because sometimes, the most dangerous mistake isn't failing to recognize a danger. It's recognizing the danger, hearing the warnings, and choosing to ignore them. Each of the 10 events we explored today was different. But history keeps teaching us the same simple lesson. The belief that nothing will happen can sometimes become one of the most dangerous mistakes of all. If you found today's video interesting, subscribe to the channel and support me by leaving a like. And tell me in the comments, out of these 10 events, which one surprised you the most? In the next video, we'll explore more of history's most astonishing events together. See you next time.